Two friends talking about everything they trying to understand. Your friend with all these light bulbs be popping in our minds. Need to share our ideas with one another. Time to talk cheap. Friends fully tripping cause we all hella booked up in these lives. Saturdays and night when we get to riffing, we get to riff and laugh cause that's alright. Talk, talk, talk is cheap. Real talk, talk, talk is cheap. Real talk, 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 talk is so cheap, cheap. It's so motherfucking cheap, 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 cheap. Can't be any cheaper unless it costs us something cheap, cheap. Because cheap, cheap is what it's gotta be. So cheap other than sometimes fake cause that's me willing to spare. Cheap, cheap, cheap and that is all we got to share. We got to take it to board these planes of reality. They know they just missed their train to Trans Central. Hey, all aboard! It's a Saturday night train. Too cheap and real talk is cheaper than ever, ever, ever. Real talk is cheap. The real talk is cheap, cheap. Real talk is cheap. The real talk is cheap, cheap. Real talk is cheap, real cheap talk. It's real talk, it's so cheap, it's so fucking cheap, cheap. Ooh, real cheap, cheap. It's so cheap, 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 cheap. Real talk is cheap. The real talk is cheap, cheap. Real talk is cheap. The real talk is cheap, cheap. Real talk is cheap, real cheap talk. It's real talk, it's so cheap, it's so fucking cheap, cheap. Ooh, real cheap, cheap. It's so cheap, 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 cheap. Unless it costs us something cheap, cheap. Because cheap, cheap is what it's gotta be. So cheap, 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 cheap. Can't be any cheaper unless it costs us something cheap, cheap. Because cheap, cheap is what it's gotta be. So cheap, other than sometimes fake, cause that's me willing to spare. Cheap, 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 and that is all we got to share. We got two tickets to board these planes of reality. They know they just missed their train to Trans Central. Hey, all aboard! It's the Saturday night train. Too cheap and real talk is cheaper than ever, ever, ever. Real talk is cheap. The real talk is cheap, cheap. Real talk is cheap. The real talk is cheap, cheap, cheap. Real talk is cheap, real cheap talk. It's real talk, it's so cheap, it's so fucking cheap, cheap. Woo, real cheap, cheap, it's so cheap, cheap, cheap.